I want to introduce our wonderful panel, and we're going to have a conversation on Palestine in U.S. politics. So with us today is Maya Berry, to my right. She's the executive director of the Arab American Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan national civil rights organization that nurtures and encourages the direct participation of Arab Americans in political and civic life in the U.S. Prior to that, she served as the legislative director for House Minority Whip David Boyner, managing the congressman's legislative strategy and developing policies on international relations, human rights, immigration, civil liberties, and trade. As a longtime Democratic Party activist, Maya served as a member of the 2016 Democratic National Convention's Platform Standing Committee and has attended all but one Democratic National Convention as a delegate, alternate, or standing committee member since 1992. Experienced. Next to her is Emad Salem, a member of the executive committee of the Texas Democratic Party and a board member of the Muslim Democratic Caucus of Texas. He serves as an election judge in the Tarrant County, Texas, and has a Bachelor of Arts in Government and Politics from the University of Texas at Dallas. And on the far right is Rasha Mubarak, who's a Palestinian-American Muslim community activist and leader. She's the communication director of the Florida Statewide Alignment Group, a collaboration, yes, of 7 Florida-based power-building organizations who are working together to shift economic and governing power towards racial justice and a truly democratic state. Rasha served as the Central Florida Regional Director for the Council on American Islamic Relations of Florida, and before that worked at the Arab American Community Center. She is also the Director of Public Relations for the Muslim Women's Organization of Orlando, the President of the Young Democrats of Orange County, and president for the Orlando chapter of the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. In 2015, Rasha co-founded Floridians Responding to Refugees, spearheading efforts to welcome and transition refugees in Central Florida. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Estee Chandler. I'm with Jewish Voice for Peace. I grew up in Los Angeles, where I worked in the film industry on both sides of the camera for decades. In 2010, I launched the Los Angeles chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace. I serve on JVP's National Legislative Leadership Team and was recently elected to the JVP National Board of Directors. Thank you. In 2014, along with Negwa Ibrahim, I became the producer and host team of the long-running KPFK radio show, Middle East in Focus. And last year, as executive producer, along with Alan Minsky, I launched the Middle East Minute Plus, a daily, nationally broadcast, short news report focusing on the Middle East. So with that, each of our panelists is going to do about a 5-minute presentation, and then we're going to have a conversation about Palestine in U.S. politics.
Yes. Well, good morning, Sabah al-Khair. So I was given 5 minutes to talk about Palestine in U.S. politics. And I was saying I could spend literally 3 hours without taking a breath on the topic. So what I'd like to do is just quickly say a few things and really devote most of our morning panel to a discussion. I'd love to answer questions and engage in conversation rather than just the talk piece of it. So just a few observations. The first is it's about engaging our political system. I work in Washington, D.C., and I should start by saying My organization, called the Arab American Institute, was established in 1985 specifically to deal with the civic engagement and political empowerment of Arab Americans as an ethnic constituency. Now, many ethnic constituencies have to organize themselves in order to be fully participant in the political process. What was unique about ours? What was unique about ours is actually Palestine. And that is that my organization exists specifically because there were concerted efforts to silence Arab Americans who wanted to engage on the issue of Palestinian human rights. So you were allowed to be an Arab American, and I collect political buttons, I'm a political animal, I have my Lebanese for Nixon buttons, you're allowed to be engaged in US politics until you picked up the mantle of Palestinian human rights. Then there was a problem. So our participation in our local civic communities, our running for local city council races, our participation on school boards, there was a litmus test for us, which is, what do you intend to bring to the table? And if it included the advocacy of Palestinian human rights, then there was a problem. So the organization was established specifically because of this issue. And every time I speak anywhere, whether on this subject or other, I lead with that, because it's important to understand that there were some who have approached this issue as a zero-sum game for decades. And I think that our presence here today, the Institute's 30-plus years worth of work, is a testament to how that's failed. But the point is that continues to be a problem today, and you need to look no further than Arab Americans running for office and the kind of ads that they run against them. But we won't get into that. So the second point is engaging our political system as it is, not as we hope it was, as we intend it to be, not aspirational. Regrettably, I deal with US politics as it is played, because we've decided that in order to impact change, we have to engage this system as it is. So I only preface that, and I welcome Q&A about what that means in terms of how we approach things. But I think that's an important piece of understanding, that I deal with power dynamics as they are until I can change them. So 25-year anniversary of Oslo, right? It got us very little. One can argue that in the span of the 2+ decades, and the redefinition of realities on the ground and the continuation of the occupation, it made things even worse. Oslo did change a great deal in Washington, though. And it's an interesting point to be made. The work on this issue before 1993, work on this issue after is significantly different. And there was a realignment in DC around how one advocated for this issue that shifted from Arabs versus Jews as a sort of division to Arab Americans and American Jews who were supportive of the peace process, and Arab Americans and American Jews who were not. And one can, again, there's much to be said about the failure of the process and how we got to where we are today. But the alliances that began to form in the 90s and that continue today, whether it's JVP and others, is an incredibly important part of understanding. And I would argue about seeing all of you together that this is also a manifestation of that. And it's a wonderful thing to see the coalitions that are here. I know that Congresswoman McCollum, who is someone I've valued tremendously for many years, is an incredible ally on these issues, and she was here last night, and I know that, unfortunately I got a cold, but I know that her speech was incredible, and it always is. Her office has been a key ally on human rights issues for the region broadly and for Palestine specifically for many years. But I just want to mention specifically about how we even get to the point of Congresswoman McCollum wanting to do the legislation that she did. If you all recall, in 2006, Congresswoman Betty McCollum issued a letter, and she chose to make it public. A member of AIPAC was meeting with her chief of staff, and they questioned basically the patriotism of her chief of staff. They questioned his allegiance to the United States based on the conversation they're having on this issue. They asked him to leave. And she issued a public letter, basically saying, until you apologize for the way that you handled my chief of staff, you're no longer welcome in my office. And that letter was made public. It was published in the New York Times. So we're talking, 12 years ago, and the world was like, wow, this is huge, oh my goodness. This is amazing. They're going to target Betty McCollum. She's going to lose her seat. The world is going to end. Well, Betty McCollum then became a member of the Appropriations Committee. And I mention it only because part of what we do, I think, is mistakenly adopt this narrative that they're so powerful they can't be defeated. And I can give you countless examples of Benny McCollum's. And I only say that to make the point that it's not this dichotomy that we sort of see in place. The pro-Israel lobby as general is increasingly aligned with an extremist government in the state of Israel. That has played out within the halls of Congress in a very meaningful way that allows us, as advocates for Palestinian human rights, as advocates for a more just U.S. policy towards the region. I mean, the point that's always made and incredibly important to make continuously, this occupation could not happen without the full participation of the United States. We paid for the wall to go up. We will pay for it to come down. We're not an objective player in this process. So when you have Americans who tell you, I'm not engaged on the issue of foreign policy, completely true. When you have members of Congress who tell you, my constituents don't care about foreign policy, completely true. That's one of the initial barriers when you go to talk to a member about this issue, is they say to me, this is not a priority. My unemployment rate in my district is this. Housing situation is this. Educational rates in our schools are this. These are all very valid points. So how do you bring them back to a conversation about something that seems so far away? Well, the reality is because we are the enabler of this occupation. We are the enabler of this unjust policy for decades. So we can't be this bystander just hoping two parties get along. No, we've allowed it to continue. That's the reason that it needs to be elevated, I think, more effectively to our members. The second point I would make is the domestic implications of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. If you are an Arab American in this country, you know all too well. The black community has explained to us the conversation they have with their sons in terms of understanding how to drive and what to do if you're stopped. Regrettably, there are conversations that happen in our community where we're told our kids to be careful on your college campus. You can advocate this way, but just be careful unto this point. Why? Because there are anonymous organizations that exist, funded at the millions of dollars, called the Canary Mission, that target you. They target you when you're active on these issues, and remarkably, they don't leave you alone when you graduate from college. We have a case of a young woman who they called her employer to say, did you know you have an anti-Semite working on your staff? After graduation. So there are, in addition to the foreign policy piece, which again, I make the case we have to get right, there are domestic implications that play out. They play out in free speech issues on college campuses. They play out in how many years did we tell the Palestinians, where is your Gandhi? Right? Where's your nonviolent approach? So what happens? Palestinian civil society launches a movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. What do? We proceed to outlaw that movement. State legislators are passing bills across the country. We have examples of multiple bills in the US Congress. We currently have legislation in the US Congress that equates anti-Semitism, the very real rising problem of anti-Semitism, with criticism of the state of Israel. My organization recently published a hate crime report. We've been seeing an influx of hate crimes since December of 2014. The presidential election only made it worse. The cases are just astonishing. You all know that. So this summer, we spent a year doing the research. The number one community that continues to be targeted by hate crimes in terms of racial community are African Americans, the black community. The number one religious community continues to be the Jewish American community with an increase in anti-Semitism. At the same time we're seeing the surge in hate crimes, we have efforts in Congress that are conflating deliberately the very real problem of anti-Semitism with free speech on this. I mean, I know that Brian was here last night too from the ACLU. I'm sure he shared the major decision that just came down. There are state legislators who have these bills, and until we legally challenge them, we're seeing a suppression of speech. And then the final point about domestic implications, if you are an Arab American, if you're Palestinian, if you are an American activist who has a profile on this issue, when you travel to the state of Israel or you attempt to enter the occupied territories, your passport is not acknowledged by the Israelis. You are held up, you are detained, you are deported, some aren't even allowed in. Our own government knows this, and we've made the case that this is not an equal protection under the law. Our US passport is not being acknowledged by another country the way that it needs to be. Those are also ways in which we need to elevate the conversation about how this incredibly skewed perspective on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict continues to impact all of us. So I could say a lot more, and I didn't even get into the stuff about the party platforms and the progression on those things, but maybe we can do some of that in the Q&A.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk about the major changes in the U.S. bipartisan support to Israel. But before I say that, before I talk about that, I'd like to tell you a small story. We have an organization in Texas called the Muslim Democratic Caucus of Texas, and it is activists that are working in the Texas Democratic Party. I have a friend, his name is Aftab, and he is a Pakistani American, and he works within the Democratic Party, and also he works on Palestinian issues. And he has worked so hard that one day I saw him last year, and I said, you know something, Aftab? And he says, what? I said, you work so hard for Palestine. When Palestine becomes a state, I think you are entitled to a Palestinian citizenship. I don't know if he could use his passport anywhere, but it will be an honorary passport. The major changes that has been happening in the U.S. bipartisan support to Israel, I would say it goes back to 2011. There are three issues I would like to discuss. The first one is the Netanyahu speech to Congress in March 2015. The second point is Bernie Sanders' debate with Hillary Clinton in Brooklyn, that is April 2016. And the third one is David Friedman's appointment as US ambassador to Israel. Netanyahu, when he came, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, when he came to Washington, D.C. in March 2015, without an invitation from the White House. He came and he delivered a speech to Congress with both houses of Congress. And that was a very major event because I cannot think of any prime minister or king or president to come to DC without an invitation from the White House. So that was something different, of course, that is because of the Israeli lobby. The speech that Netanyahu delivered was boycotted by a lot of Democratic congressmen and women, and we applaud them for doing that. I believe 50 boycotted his speech. The main issue for his speech was the Iran nuclear deal. And there was a proposal or a House bill and a Senate bill also tried to kill this Iran deal, but it did not pass. Of course, when Trump was elected, he promised he will repeal this law, and he did cancel it. The second issue that shows there is a huge bipartisan division in DC in concerning to support of Israel is the debate that we had in Brooklyn between Senator Bernie Sanders and Secretary of State. And I'm going to quote what Senator Bernie Sanders said. He said, if we are ever going to bring peace to that region, the Middle East, of course, which has been so much hatred and so much war, we are going to have to treat the Palestinians with respect and dignity. No one has ever said anything like this, especially in his high caliber, from a major party. We applaud him, and of course, during that debate, there was a lot of applause and a lot of free Palestine shouting, and it was an awesome moment. Right after that, Senator Bernie Sanders has appointed 3 very well-versed individuals in the Palestinian issue to the platform committee. It was Dr. Cornel West, Congressman Keith Ellison, and Dr. Jim Zogby. They tried very hard to change the narrative in the platform committee, and of course it was not easy because this platform has been just about the same for the last 40 or some years maybe. We have tried to change the platform in Texas, and it is a struggle, but the way I look at it, even though we do not accomplish what we want right there at that moment, but it is always an education to the people. And I want to talk about the resolutions that we tried to pass in Texas. For the last 10 years, we have worked within the Democratic Party in Texas, and we have always presented a resolution calling on our government to recognize the state of Palestine. In 2008, the first time we presented this resolution in Tarrant County, Texas, it was a war in that resolution committee. I mean, the other side was pushing so hard, and we were pushing so hard, and finally it passed 3-2 and 2 not voting. So that resolution passed and was presented to the Texas Democratic Party Executive Committee. And that was the first time, and it only passed from one Senate district in Texas. This year, 2018, the state convention was held in Fort Worth, in our town, and we have presented a very similar resolution, and this time it passed from 7 Senate districts in Texas. Even though it did not pass at the state convention, but imagine how many people talked about the state of Palestine. Talking about 7 different resolution committees. Each committee represents 300 to 400 different delegates to the state convention. We had a convention of 8,500 delegates. So probably 3,000 to 4,000 people talked about the state of Palestine and why the U.S. need to recognize the state of Palestine. So education is the key right here. Thank you. The last point is David Friedman's appointment as U.S. ambassador to Israel. Normally, the U.S. ambassador to Israel follows very close the position of the State Department on the Palestinian-Israeli issue. But David Friedman was not like any other ambassador we had before. As soon as he was nominated, 5 former US ambassadors to Israel wrote a letter to Congress not to approve his nomination. In addition to that, quite few organizations, including J Street and other major Jewish American organizations, were against his nomination. And the reason is David Friedman is a supporter of the Israeli settlements. He have raised $2 million a year he was raising to build more settlement in Israel, in the West Bank. That's why a lot of people were against him, and I was one of the people who went to Senator Cornyn's office in Dallas, and we lobbied him not to approve his nomination, and of course, he was approved, and I believe only one Democratic senator voted for his approval. I think it was Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey. When the vote went to the full Senate, his nomination was approved almost on a party line, 52 to 46. This is kind of strange, by the way, in the US Congress and the US Senate, because normally the ambassador to Israel is voted and approved by a voice call. There was never a roll call. So this is the first time, and you could tell how much bipartisan it is becoming right now. I want to thank you all for giving me the opportunity, and
Hello, hello. Hey. Give it up for our moderator and panelists, y'all. This is powerful. My name is Rasha, and something I've been saying all weekend is I am so impressed with how everyone is so engaged, how every speaker, facilitator is a powerhouse. I've never seen so many people engaged for a long period of time, for over a course of 3 days for some of us. So give it up for all of you. This is something that I think is so critical and so dear to all of our hearts, and just hearing from all of you and listening to some of the panelists over the weekend, it's definitely evolving to what we saw. We were transitioning from an era that once was, if you even spoke on behalf of the rights of Palestinians, you were cornered, you were deemed terrorists, you were all sorts of negative connotations. And to now, we're moving into an arena where we can actually talk about the rights of Palestinians on a certain level. And that is due to all of you and the course of Bernie Sanders, and also the conversations around the presidential elections. And sometimes what we perceive to be bad may actually be good in our benefit. And how do we play on those components when we see an opportunity like that? I was asked to speak specifically in my 5 minutes about how do you leverage relationships, whether they be with your congressional leaders or elected officials locally and on a federal level, and even your local advocates. I want to share a quick story. Y'all remember the Pulse nightclub shooting? Okay, so that happened in Orlando. And one of the first phone calls I made was to my dear friend, Representative Carlos Guillermo Smith, and he's LGBTQ. He's the first Latinx elected official in the state of Florida. And we said, we're not going to let this divide us, we're gonna stand together. And he talks about that every single day. He talks about how Rasha called him, Rasha stood with him, and he's gonna fight for me in Tallahassee. When we talk about Florida, it's Florida, y'all. Yes. Florida recently, with the most recent anti-BDS legislation that came through Tallahassee, there was 3 state representatives and 1 senator, that was 2 senators, but it became 1 senator because she changed her vote, that voted no on the anti-BDS legislation, and they are all from Orlando. Yes. They're all my friends. It doesn't mean that we won, but it was a small win, and it shows that relationship building is super critical. I talk about, you all saw the picture of the Syrian refugee boy that washed up on shore? Yes. The world was outraged, even though the conflict had been going on for 3 to 4 years. And I thought to myself, why are people outraged now? And I remember it was an image of a baby, and something we can all relate to, whether you have your own, a sibling, someone you babysit, but there was a familiarity. And if you have that commonality, you're able to build a relationship. So relationships are built on familiarity, commonalities. So how do you do that when talking about Palestine? Because a lot of times we expect people, especially elected officials, to do what's just right. But that's not the case. A lot of times when we come saying, why did you vote this way? And they're like, this is the first time I see your face. This is the first time I hear your name. There's no relationship there. Many times I'm a person all about accountability, but there's a way to champion people that once they're in there to celebrate the victories. Now, in the movement world, I was very hesitant to become president of Young Democrats of Orange County. I said, oh no, I'm a movement sister. You can't fetishize this. And then I started thinking about it. I spoke with mentor leaders across the country, and they're like, this is your way to leverage. This is your way to talk about the issues that matter. So I made a promise that I was going to bring the issues of the people on this level to the Young Democrats of Orange County. When I tell you I've had board members resign because I refused to post about a Democrat congressional leader because of her anti-immigrant views, I've had board members resign. But the reality is, how do you do that? Making sure that you are present in spaces, making sure that you are being there for all issues. So what ended up happening in Orlando, from the Pulse nightclub shooting, and then I sit on as a facilitator for the Trust Orlando, which is a coalition of 38 immigrant advocacy groups. We became the first city in the Southeast to become a trust city, which means that law enforcement are not allowed to comply with ICE. So this is something that we fought for a year and a half. Yeah. It's pretty exciting. And in this fight, I remember community members calling up my bosses and saying, Rasha's upsetting the mayor. We don't do that. We come from a community where we're photo op, and we just celebrate, and we give elected officials, we give candidates our money, we give them our vote, but they don't take our voice to Tallahassee, and they don't take our voice to DC. So being in these spaces, what happened in Central Florida is that they started seeing the same people. So when it became with the anti-BDS legislation, they thought that they can isolate us and marginalize us even in the most progressive spaces. But what ended up happening is that's when the movement, that's when the people said, no, we stand with this on Rasha and everyone in this community about this issue. That's how you were able to bring alliances. And that when you talk about relationships in this kind of work, there's two kinds. There's a base and allies. Knowing who's on your base and who has your shared values. Because not all the time are you going to be supporting each other on every aspect, but ones that do not compromise your hardcore values, right? And then knowing when you're on the forefront and knowing when you're an ally is important. So being able to navigate in these spaces when we're talking about anti-blackness, being there as an ally, and being on the forefront when you're talking about Palestine, and having that kind of support system. In the movement, there's terms called agitation versus irritation. If I'm in a relationship with Maya, I can tell her, give her some feedback, for instance, on today's panel, but it's only good feedback. But let's say I had some feedback to give her to help her move on an issue. Because I'm in a relationship with her, I can agitate her. If I'm not in a relationship with her, I'm just going to irritate her, which is irritation. So making sure that with these candidates and elected officials, you're in a true, authentic relationship with them where you're able to move them to how you're able to see it. And some of the things of how we do this, and I think it's important, and we'll probably get into this, is when we talk about different components, because I think sometimes we think there's one way to pass legislation or get people on our side. I think there's all ways, right? The mobilizations and the rallies that have a call to action, of course. The lobbying, also any kind of organizing, if it's relief, whatever it is, they all fit together in one puzzle. And I think how do you do this is, Maya talked about earlier, we have to come up with a system that protects our advocates, that protects these activists and these institutions that are literally putting their lives or careers on the line. But in the same sense, we have to come up with a system to protect the elected officials that are essentially doing what they call political suicide. So how do we do that? So when these elected officials voted a certain way, we made sure to do, just like we do in an accountability process, call these elected officials and tell them why they're voting this way, call these elected officials, email these elected officials, and thank them. This is how, because they want to be able to feel support. And I think that it's important to educate us as communities first and foremost before we send them out there. Talking points, we have a lot of talking points, but keeping it short, because the opposition and the challengers have very few talking points that shut down the conversations. Recently, I'm very triggered with the Mayor Gillum election and the governor's election in Florida. And something that I think a lot of us Floridians are concerned about is, how do we have that conversation when they feel that they have to be loyal to a PAC or a community that has 600,000 voters just in South Florida alone? Making sure that you start talking to the opposition, right? As a young Democrat of Orange County, there's a Florida Young Democrat president who's a Jewish American. And when DeSantis got up and made an atrocious video about how other people are anti-Semitic, I said, for following BDS legislation, I called him and I said, I know you're not into BDS, but we can talk about that another time. But I know you would fight to protect my freedom to boycott. And he said, yes. I go, so we're going to go Facebook Live as a Muslim Palestinian president of Young Dems, and you're a Jewish American president of Florida Young Dems. Let's do this. I had campaigns calling me not to do this. And I said, no, this is a conversation that needs to happen. So in that conversation, he says, as a Jewish American, I'm not for BDS, but I will fight for Rasha's right to her freedom to boycott. So that, yeah. He got backlash from and then I ended up speaking with the next person that believes BDS is anti-Semitic. I said, I called him. Every time something happens, he even published an article about me in an indirect way, and I still called him in the Orlando Sentinel. I said, listen, I go, we have to talk about these issues. And he's like, Rasha, you're just a great advocate. You got 4 people to vote a certain way. I'm like, 4 people? Like, give me those 4 people, right? Like, I won vote against the opposition, and they're all up in arms. We need to learn how to be up in arms all the time, but also championing the people standing with us.
Thank you. So, not to contradict one of my shiras, Nora Erakat, I want to offer a slightly different concept. Progressive, except for Palestine, is a unicorn. It's a fantasy. Like progressive Zionists of the California Democratic Party, it's simply an oxymoron. Suppressing the progress of any people or minority group is not progressive, period. Supporting a political movement that has practiced apartheid for 70 years is just not progressive, full stop. I can only hope that the old political saying, as California goes, so goes the nation, as a result of innovation starting in our state, spreading around the country, and social and political movements originating in California, spreading east, will also be true for our movement. I say that because last year, activists for Palestinian rights who engage in California party politics organized and passed the most progressive party policy in the country on Palestinian rights. What the proponents, who were in a good position to pass a great resolution with Karen Bernal, the chair of the Progressive Caucus of the California Democratic Party, and strong supporter of Palestinian rights as a co-author, what we found as we were working the phones in advance of and then in the halls of the convention itself to collect the required number of endorsements to keep moving the resolution forward is that for younger, more progressive, and sometimes smarter political activists, Palestine is increasingly a defining issue. Another thing that was learned in the very contentious negotiations on the language of the resolution in committee was that the other side was nervous. They were very nervous. After all, they can read Frank Luntz's polls as easily as those in support of Palestinian equality can. And what was clear from those sidebar meetings and negotiations moderated by a leader of the resolutions committee is that the side led by Democrats for Israel believed that the resolution as originally drafted in support of Palestinian rights could win a floor vote. So their only defense was to try to water down the language as much as possible. In the face of our opposition's zeal to support anti-BDS legislation and stigmatize, suppress, and penalize Palestinian rights by falsely and maliciously trying to smear them as anti-Semitic, one small concession that was made was to insert a line that the California Democratic Party, quote, also opposes anti-Semitic or Islamophobic language brought into the debate. A small concession to have made to be able to make it policy, the policy of the largest political party in the nation, that one, decried the failure of US administrations to back up measured criticism of Israel's occupation, quote, with actual steps to change the status quo and bring about a real peace process, end quote. Two, it called on Washington to work through the United Nations and other international bodies to promote a just peace based on full equality and security for Palestinians and Israeli Jews alike, and human rights and international law. Three, it quoted Bernie Sanders saying that peace, quote, means achieving self-determination, civil rights, and economic well-being for the Palestinian people, end quote. And four, the policy rejects any attempt to restrict or penalize those who exercise their right to express their views through nonviolent action, to effect change or discourse, full and open public discourse on Israel-Palestine, and disavows the conflation of criticism of a country's policies with hatred of its people. In the end, the resolution was approved in committee as part of a package of measures which could be voted on unanimously on the convention floor without debate. Proponents of the resolution believe that those who opposed it in committee realized that the resolution would pass. So they chose not to pull it for an open floor debate and vote, preferring not to call any more attention to the resolution and potential landslide vote on the floor in front of the international media that was present. This resolution is evidence that increasing numbers of politically active Americans, including American Jews, support equality and human rights for Palestinians and believe that accountability is an important step towards a just resolution. As that number grows, it is our job, all of our job, to continue to organize them, to pass resolutions like the one California passed in every state, and to use them to dissuade legislators from supporting anti-BDS legislation, and eventually to support BDS. Just as progressive leaders did in the case of South Africa. So with that, I want to tease out some of the things that you all talked about in your statements that I think are very important for us to understand in order to keep moving forward. Like all things in life, political advocacy starts with developing relationships, as you said, and maintaining them. So how do we successfully balance pushing our legislators to support Palestinian rights, pushing back against legislation intended to punish activism on behalf of those rights, without destroying those relationships with the legislators that we've worked so hard to develop? What roles do compromise and accountability play in that equation?
So I would start by saying divide them up into two different buckets. The first being, is your member already active on this issue? And most of your members are not. And if they are not, meet them where they're at, which is where I start with understanding that foreign policy is generally not a priority in most congressional districts across the country. So emphasize, and I say this as both what we practice and because I think it can be most impactful, emphasize the importance of how this issue plays out in terms of U.S. national security interests. What we're doing is counter to our own interests long term. And it doesn't make sense. It's actually, we're not acting as a rational actor in this area. So the ability to elevate that piece of it and talk about that, I think, is important for members of Congress. It doesn't always, it's important. The other point, again, I'd make is because there's lack of interest in foreign policy, emphasize the domestic implications. It's a key piece of it. On our website, aiusa.org, we have an issue brief literally called The Domestic Implications of the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict, where we highlight each of these issues. So if your member says, I don't do foreign policy, that's okay. There are ways in which it's playing out that are important. And then separate from that, your member votes on, we have 13 appropriation bills in Congress every year. Foreign ops is one of them. There are commerce, justice, and state are others. There are different places where this issue comes up, even if your member is not on the Foreign Relations Committee and doesn't identify this as a particularly important issue. So that's the one bucket, which I think is the majority of people. The second bucket are those who have chosen to take a profile on this issue. And very few choose to do so to advocating on the Palestinian human rights piece. Most of them see themselves as pro-Israeli members of Congress, and they will support whatever Israeli government is in place, as opposed to, I think, looking at the complexities of the debate that happens in Israel proper on this issue. Those members of Congress, I don't think anybody should get a pass. They have constituents. And even if they are among the most pro-Israeli on some policies, they still represent you. And you should still go to them and say, I understand you took this position, this is why I think it's wrong, and this is why I think you need to do better to represent me and my broader community. Having said that, I think my colleague makes a good point when she said, let's not let the first meeting that you ever have with them be the one that tells them why they're so completely wrong. Jim Zogby is the president of my organization, always tells this story about, when he'd approach people, I can't tell his stories, he's a really good storyteller, but he came in and he told the member of Congress this, this, and this, and he pounded on the table, and then he let him finish, and the congressman said, I don't even like you right now. I just told a joke and you didn't laugh. And I'm telling you, that's seared into my brain. My job is to work with people so that when I call them, they call me back. So that's part of what we have to do here. We know that justice is on our side on this, but at the same time, we have to be able to bring others along with us. So even the most pro-Israeli member has to understand that you are the constituent and you have a right to be heard. Spend a few minutes looking at their website in terms of recent press releases. They love, they want to talk about things they've done. I guarantee you there's something they did that's okay with you. Just check the press release, say, I'm glad you did this, but now I need to talk about this. I think that helps.
The Democratic Party is a coalition of individuals. Since Bernie Sanders was nominated, or he became a candidate for US President 2016, the Democratic Party has moved to the left. A lot of candidates are campaigning on issues that are important to everyone: health, health care for all, public education, minimum wage, $15 minimum wage. All these issues, we could work on them because it's important to all of us. Somebody once asked Congressman Keith Ellison when he was in Houston a couple of years ago, in Dallas a couple of years ago, and he told him, let me ask you a question. He said, what? He said, you are a Muslim, you are a black man, but you are elected from an 80% or 85% white district. How do you do that? And he says, I just talk to them about important issues to me and to them. Talk to them about health care for all, public education, minimum wage, $15 minimum wage. Those are important to me and those are important to them. So that's how he got elected, and now he's running for Attorney General of Minnesota. The way I look at it, education, education, and education. A lot of elected officials do not know where Palestine is. The way it starts is from the city council. So if someone gets elected on the city council in your town or in your city, those people probably never heard of a Palestinian human rights issue, or why is it occupied, or why the Palestinians are fighting for their rights. A lot of people don't know. So education is the main thing right here, and I would recommend that you call your city council member and meet with them and talk to them about issues that are important to you in your area, plus talk to them about the Palestinian rights issues. I have done a couple of presentations at different churches in North Texas, and I tell you, it was a very inspiring engagement with the people, because I never attended anything official at a church, you know, except, of course, going to a ceremony here and there. But I was invited by the Universalist Unitarian Church in Arlington, and they said, can you speak about Palestine? And I said, yes, definitely. So I prepared a PowerPoint, and I went there, and those people were amazing. I mean, very engaged with me, very supportive, talked for about 45 minutes about the history of Palestine from the late 1800s up to the 20th century, and then they asked questions, 15, 20 minutes, and it was very engaging, and it was very satisfying for me to be there and tell people the story of Palestine. The other level of engagement I would suggest is, the first thing is individuals and institutions. Individuals is someone that you meet on the street or restaurant, or you don't have a whole lot of time to talk to them about Palestine, but if you engage them, just whatever, you could tell them something quick about Palestine. But the more important one is to engage with the churches, mosques, synagogues, and temples. I find them very supportive, so this is something that I'm taking on myself to start doing more often. So we were talking about the city council, and those city council people, a few of them will move on to become state representatives and state senators. So when you engage them as city councilman or city councilwoman, you become their friend. They become kind of dependent on you, especially if you are in the same area and you could help them in their campaigns. When they become state representative or state senator, they still count on you and they remember you. After that, some of these people from state senator and state representative, they become congressmen and congresswomen and US senator. So my suggestion is to get involved on the local level.
And I'll just echo a couple things, that building these relationships are strengthened by developing trust. And so, as Maya said, know your audience, know their work, know the topics that are important to them, connect with them on the things that they work on, because all these things can be connected to Palestine, whether it's the incarceration of children and separation of families, to the attack on our civil rights. Ultimately, our goal is to become a resource for them to call Maya and say, hey, I just heard about this thing, what is it? Or for us to be the first one to tell them when a new bill or resolution is introduced, when the recent horrific Anti-Semitism and Awareness Act was reintroduced, we were able to contact them, our coalition of organizations, and let them know that this was happening before they wrongly saw something that said, that it was against anti-Semitism and put their name on it. And as a result, not a lot of people have co-sponsored it. So becoming a resource, building that trust is vitally important. So we know that the internet, and we are up against the clock, so this is truly going to be a speed round. We know that the internet changed politics dramatically and clearly during the 2008 presidential elections. And since then, awareness about Palestine and Israel's oppression of Palestinians has increased greatly, which has resulted in the shifting poll numbers in support of Israel and Palestine over the last decade. How do Palestine solidarity activists harness these developments and the shift that we've achieved in gaining some support for Palestinian rights in Congress between now and 2020 so that the next administration is more supportive of Palestinian rights?
So the partisan divide piece is real and critical to understand. We've been doing polling on this issue for decades. We've seen the trajectory. Gallup and Pew both have now come to some significant differentials in terms of the spread between Democrats and Republicans on approval ratings for Israel, and on the issue of the U.S. taking a credible, more balanced approach. We've seen that play out both in terms of Congress, and I think it's important to point out, we're having the conversation about these platform positions, both on the California state level as well as on the federal level. I mean, what is a party platform? It means, in practice, almost absolutely nothing, right? It's a position paper that says, this is what we aspire to. The role of social media, particularly in the last election, really transformed that. This is something that used to be done in a room like this, and it wasn't streamed, and nobody understood anything, and then we just plowed through. The first mentions of the State of Israel predate the existence of the State of Israel in both the Republican and Democratic Party platforms. The first time they talk about establishing a homeland for Jews in Palestine is in 1944, post the Balfour Declaration. First time that openly debated in Congress in 1922. So why are we talking about these documents that don't do anything? Because they're bellwethers. They're an indication of where people believe their constituents to be on this issue. So the amount of pandering that goes into putting that together, and I don't say that in a disparaging way, they want to align where they think people are, is an important piece of this. So the fight that happened in 1988, that was the first time ever. The issue of Palestinian statehood was brought to the Democratic Convention. Jim Zogby gave the speech on the floor thanks to the candidacy of Jesse Jackson. I was a delegate in 92. I literally remember being on the Democratic Convention floor with a sign that said Palestine statehood now, and the people following us around were talking to little earpieces saying they're between Iowa and Dakota now. And I remember thinking, what is happening? Like, I'm walking around with a sign that says Palestinian statehood, and I'm being treated like there's a strategic positioning and they need to know where we are. We were already inside the party. In this last time around, let's be clear. Everybody in that room came up to me later and said, I didn't vote with you, but I agree. I get it. But I got to tell you, to hear from union members who told me personally, I don't know these people individually. They're just telling me I didn't agree with my membership, because that's who was the opposition when I debated the specific things. People agree with us. It's about getting this to the point where it is, where we minimize the political price to pay. And I think we're there on so many levels. You know, we talked about the partisan divide. The other piece of the partisan divide that's incredible is 18 to 29-year-olds. They're done with this. This doesn't make sense to them. It doesn't make sense to them like lots of other things don't make sense to them, and they don't buy it anymore. So I think there's an incredible space for us to step into on these issues in that way. And it's a bellwether for where our country is, and I think the majority of people know there's an injustice. The majority of people understand that the U.S. role in it isn't positive, but those who are advocating are increasingly marginalized. So we talked about David Friedman. David Friedman, remember, is that guy who refers to so-called Palestinian refugees. And before I turn the microphone over I want to just caution us now in a post-Trump environment. It is absolutely imperative that we elevate the humanitarian suffering of the Palestinian people, because it is incomprehensible to think about the generations of refugees living the way that they are today in countries in that region. So that has to happen. But I caution you, it is not enough to simply talk about Palestinian humanitarian suffering, because they can take final status issues like Jerusalem off the map, right? That's what they want to do. They can pretend 750,000 Palestinian refugees are there instead of 5 million, but they can't remove the Palestinian political aspirations. You don't erase Palestinian identity with your ability to kind of play and fudge numbers so that you can impact the right of return. So I think it's imperative on us as we have these conversations, and we have them on the state levels where most people are like, what are you talking about? That's a bit more complicated. It is about elevating human suffering, but it's also about meeting Palestinian aspirations. And that does not go away, and that can't be written out of this process no matter what happens.
I want to echo everyone's sentiment on stage, and I think that it's important to also we've identified PEP, which is Progressive Except Palestine, but there's also POOPS, Progressives Only on Palestine. And I think that, so we can't be POOPS, okay? So we have to make sure that we are part of the conversation. A lot of this advocacy work is kind of, if you think of media, they're not gonna go and cover a story just because y'all fed homeless people. It has to be relative, right? Like in these dark times where they're combating xenophobia, they're still feeding, there's a way to communicate that without undermining another movement. So when we're talking about Palestine, we have to be relative, and we have to make sure that we're continuing to be relative. So how do we do that? So what we want to do is, as we approach the 2020 elections, is stay relative, whether that's local, federal, but also in conversations about what's happening around us. When we talk about the refugee crisis, say the Palestinians are second, third time refugees. When we're talking about anti-immigration, let's talk about the anti-immigration in Israel. The policies, the racism, the LGBTQ community that is marginalized in Israel. So making sure that you are relative to the conversations that our people are passionate about here, that you are passionate about here, and bringing it to the table. Another way is we need to shut down those talking points that don't allow those conversations to be furthered. The first thing someone, they asked me was like, well, do you believe that Israel has a right to exist? And I was like, yo, I'm here to talk about human basic rights. Do you believe that Palestinians have a right to exist? Do you believe that I have a right to exist? Do you believe that my cousin has a right to exist as he walks to school and not get shot at? So being able to have those conversations, being prepared, so when they give you those questions, you're prepared and equipped to be like, I want to talk about basic human rights of Palestinians. You're over here and I'm right here. I'm talking about the limited water supply and the food supply into Gaza and the shattering of little boys' dreams as they are taken out of their homes at 3 o'clock in the morning. Because that's systemic, that's intentional. We need to talk about that, right? And then when they ask you one state or two state, again, we're talking about basic human rights of the Palestinians. Let's talk about that first. We have to talk about the occupation, the oppression, and educating them. So learning how to navigate those questions within the circles, because when they get the questionnaires of endorsements, you better believe those questions are even on a local level that has nothing to do with Florida politics or wherever you may live. Do you support BDS? Do you support anti-BDS legislation? So then when it talks about BDS, you want to talk about the constitutionality of it, right? But not to where you're so much about the constitutionality and the rights to boycott that you are also advocating, like, in a sense of, like, the white supremacists have the rights to boycott. No, like, you still want to include empathy. But as activists, as advocates and lobbyists, we have to be able to separate empathy versus benefits. Again, because we can't always go in there with, this is the right thing to do. We have to go in there, well, how does this benefit this election? Because when you talk about Palestine being a progressive issue, that's how you're able to bring it to where it benefits them. Palestine is a progressive issue. It's about anti-blackness, it's about immigration rights, it's about LGBTQ rights, it's about Islamophobia, it's about xenophobia, making sure that this fits within the progressive baseline. This is not gonna marginalize and isolate Arab, Palestinian Americans, Muslim Americans. It's gonna isolate and marginalize your voters, and making sure that you, as a candidate, implement that hope in these people unconditionally, because the lines in Florida are long, it's hot, it's humid, and when they take it to the polls, it's because they want to vote for you. So telling the candidate how you make that happen, giving them the hard numbers of who you represent, naming the advocates, bringing in people like Dream Defenders, bringing in advocacy groups like ACLU, talking about people that really are moving the needle. And the last thing I want to say is, with the Gillum campaign, it's been, with the governor's campaign in Florida, it's been a topic of who's more anti-Palestinian at this point. Feeling marginalized and isolated in even the most progressive spaces, having those conversations, sometimes even telling them, hey, throw us a bone, we want to continue to advocate for you. Giving them the talking points. This is what we're willing to compromise. If you can say you'll protect our rights to boycott, we might put our shirts back on and continue to advocate. But knowing when to compromise and where to stop is important too.
The election of Donald Trump made a lot of people worried and scared. And of course, that brought a lot of volunteers. And a lot of these volunteers, they work on the same issues like we work on. And his election also showed the divide between Democrats and Republicans on Israel. It became very obvious. And by the way, it made it a whole lot easier for me and for a lot of people to criticize Israel and Trump at the same time. We have a couple of more years to, unless he, of course, gets impeached next year. Otherwise, 2 more years of criticizing him and Israel together.
1 minute closing, and I'm not saying this during your 1 minute closing to not have the conversations. I'll be over there if you want to yell at me. Let's be clear about what we're dealing with, right? We're working with members of Congress who believe in Israeli exceptionalism. So in order to approach that, I have to be honest about what is on the receiving end of this. So I also want to caution us as we think about both these midterm elections and for 2020, to think about not developing our own litmus tests on our side. I approach members of Congress regularly saying, I think you're wrong in terms of your position on BDS, but I don't care if you oppose it. I need you to support the Constitution and the First Amendment. And that is a position that is both rational and appropriate. I don't care if a member of Congress, let me say it this way. The idea that within our own activist community, we now have developing increasingly a litmus test on one state or 2 states. That doesn't serve anybody. That continues to marginalize us in a way that's not helpful, and I think we need to be thinking about those things too. Again, I started by saying I'm an actor in the world as it is, not as I want it to be. And for us, I feel like we don't have the privilege. Generations of refugees continue to exist. We don't have the privilege of saying I'm only principled and not relevant. We need to be both.
I want to thank our amazing panelists, Maya Berry, Executive Director of Arab American Institute, Emad Salem, a member of the Executive Committee of the Texas Democratic Party, and Rasha Mubarak, President of the Young Democrats of Orange County. In my last minute, I want to remind everybody, let's use our collective energy, join the Twitter storm, get out your phones, tweet. We have over 1,500 tweets so far. Let's see. Tweet at your elected representatives. They were elected to represent you. Tell them to take action. Thank you so much. Go out, engage, establish relationships. Let's put Palestine on the agenda.